The next chapter that we have for over summer break is chapter 2, basic chemistry. Now, again, I realize that we got cut short last year with COVID and you didn't make it through the whole chemistry class. What I wanted to reassure you is that the chemistry that we need to know with biology is pretty basic. You don't need to know about like electron orbitals and all like the equations from chemistry. This isn't very math based with the chemistry, but you still have to know a lot about the properties and a lot about the chemical composition of atoms and how they make up molecules and compounds. So one thing I want to reassure you is I definitely struggled through this when I was in high school and even in college. So I understand what it is to go through chemistry and kind of like, oh man, this is kind of tough. I get it. I was right there with you. Being on this side of it, being a teacher now, I definitely have a deep love for chemistry. So I'll try to break it down as best as I can and show you techniques that I use and kind of ways that I've learned the basics of chemistry. And I hope it helps you as well. Starting us off with matter, this is anything that takes up space and has mass. Just remember those two things. It has to have mass and has to take up space. Now, I have the three different types of matter down there: solid, liquid, gas. There's also a fourth type. It's called plasma. I'm not going to get in the whole conversation with plasma, but it's technically, it's still part of matter. But just kind of understand those two basic concepts going forward. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. Elements are substances that cannot be broken down into similar or simpler substances with different properties. There's 92 naturally occurring elements. After that, scientists usually have to collide different elements, and they only really exist for, partial seconds, and it's again a very complicated process. But just understand that once we break down like compounds, anything that is matter, we can't break them down further past element without losing some basic properties, basic characteristics about that element. So if you break down hydrogen into the subatomic particles, which we're going to talk about next, it loses the properties that hydrogen has. So hydrogen is going to react the same no matter if you're in India, if you're in China, if you're in Africa, Europe, Canada, South America. Hydrogen is going to be the same. Let's not talk about isotopes or things like that, but hydrogen is going to be the same no matter where you are on Earth or in the universe for that matter. CHOMPs, I'm sure you've heard of in chemistry. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur make up about 95% of an organism. And I would definitely know those top four, the carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. They're in almost every single macromolecule, and we're going to talk more about the macromolecules later on in the next chapter. But those are four and really six very, very important elements that we're going to talk about in macromolecules. Now, the atomic theory states that all elements are made of tiny particles called atoms. These atoms are made of subatomic particles, which we're going to get to next. But the atomic symbol is one or two letters that represent that element. So like H for hydrogen or He for helium. Now, these elements are made up of atoms. Atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Think sub meaning smaller. They're a portion of the atom, and they are made up of protons, electrons, and neutrons. So the three different subatomic particles are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons are positively charged. Electrons are negatively charged, and neutrons they have no charge. Now the location for each: protons and neutrons are in the nucleus, while electrons are in electron shells or outside of the nucleus. Now, you can see the subatomic particles chart there. You can see where it has the charge and the location. What I'm going to talk about next is the atomic mass unit. All you have to really know about the atomic mass unit is it's a way of measuring how heavy a subatomic particle is. Protons and neutrons roughly have about the same AMU, or atomic mass unit. They roughly have the same weight. It says 1 here, but again, once you dive deeper, there's some differences. We're not going to get into those differences, but they equivalently have about the same atomic mass unit. Electrons have no mass unit. Now, it doesn't mean they actually really don't have mass. They do technically have a mass, but it's so insignificant we don't count it in the mass of an atom. So I would know the electric charge, the atomic mass unit, and the location of the three different atomic particles. Next part of chemistry that you should know are things that you might see on a periodic table. You can see your atomic number represents the number of protons in a nucleus. Now, you probably have heard this before, but protons regulate what element an atom is. So you can change the number of neutrons and electrons, and it might, yes, change the qualities or the characteristics of that atom. But what we focus on when we look at what an element is or what an atom is, we look at the number of protons. Once we change the number of protons, then we're changing what element it is. Here with oxygen, you can see there's 8 protons in the nucleus. If we take one of those protons away, or we add a proton to the atom here and add to the nucleus, we change what element it is. If you change the number of protons and if you change the number of electrons and neutrons, you're changing maybe some of the characteristics, but it's still oxygen. When you change the number of protons, that's when you change what element it is. Now, mass number and the atomic mass are very similar, but they're different. Mass number is just the number of protons and neutrons in an atom. And again, you're going to record that in AMU units. The atomic mass is the average of the mass numbers. So you're going to have different types of elements or different types of isotopes for a particular element. It's just the average of those mass numbers. And you don't really need to go in depth and kind of understand what an atomic mass is, but understand that we find atomic mass below where the element is, usually on a periodic table. Now you can see this partial periodic table. You can see the atomic number. You can see the atomic symbol. Usually under it will have the element name, and then you have the mass number or atomic mass for that element. Like I talked about before, isotopes, these are atoms with different numbers of neutrons. And what you're going to see is, like here with carbon, you're going to have different numbers that come after carbon. It's like carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14. That just means there is a different number of neutrons for that particular atom or that particular element. So they have more or less neutrons than what you would expect by doing some calculations. Now, to find the atomic mass, you take, again, there's some math involved here, but you take the averages from these based on the proportions, and that's how you really find out the atomic mass. To make these compounds and molecules, we have to have elements or atoms of different elements bond together, forming chemical bonds. Now, we're not going to dive deep into why atoms only want 8 valence electrons, but understand that atoms typically only want 8 valence electrons. Valence electrons are the electrons in the outermost shell, and they are what really gives the properties and characteristics to different atoms. Now, again, I'm going very superficial around atoms. So if you dive deeper, you can find instances that disprove what I'm saying, like like helium only has 2, but it's happy. It's a noble gas. Understand, I'm just trying to give you a very easy to understand explanation of why certain molecules and certain atoms form in different ways. So you can see chlorine here has 7 electrons in its outer shell. You can count these valence electrons. What happens is sodium has 1. It wants to give one of those electrons to chlorine. Now, chlorine looks like it has 8 valence electrons, which it does. And it looks like sodium kind of only technically has 2 valence electrons here. We're not going to dive deep into why that happens or either the whole octet rule itself. But I just want you to understand that electrons are being shared or given and taken between different elements to form these chemical bonds. Lewis dot structures are something you probably did a lot in chemistry, but we really don't need to know too much about them in biology, but you should know the basics. Lewis dot structures just show us where chemical compounds form between different atoms and different elements. You can see here a line between each element represents a chemical bond. That's really important to know going forward. So what we're going to see is NH3. It's going to form this chemical compound here. Okay, you can see each of these lines represents a single bond. We're going to talk later about double bonds and triple bonds, but you might also see these with 2 lines between an atom. That just means it's a double bond, or 3 lines, which means it's a triple bond. But again, we just need to know that these lines represent a chemical bond between 2 different elements. You can see here, these chemical bonds are in place of 2 electrons. So every time you see a line, it means it's a chemical bond, but it also means that there is 2 electrons being either shared or given and taken between 2 different elements. Next, we're going to talk about the difference between molecules and compounds. There are some just like minor differences, and you can usually use these interchangeably. I'm not going to get like on your case about them, but the true difference between a molecule and compound is a molecule is any combination of elements connected by chemical bonds. A compound is a molecule that includes more than one. So you can see here on the right hand side, we have atoms here, we have molecules, and we have compounds. You can see a molecule can be between the same element. This is technically a molecule, but not a compound. You can see different elements making up this molecule slash compound. Since there are different elements in this molecule, it also makes it a compound. So here you can see again the molecule in red on the right hand side. It's just saying, hey, there's only two atoms of the same element. It's just a molecule. Once you add in a combination of different elements, that makes it a compound. You can see more examples here of compounds in a mixture. Now, the way I like to remember this, all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. So covalent bonds next. Covalent bonds occur when two atoms share electrons. And how I tell kids to remember the difference between the two, just remember ionic, give, covalent, share. Ionic, give, covalent, share. Ionic, give, covalent, share. I can't stress to you how important knowing the difference between ionic and covalent bonds are. So again, covalent bonds occur when two atoms share electrons. You can see carbon dioxide up here. They're going to share the two electrons here. You can see the purplish bluish electrons here for oxygen, and they're being shared with carbon, but carbon's also sharing two of its electrons in its outer shell. Now, this forms the octet rule for both oxygen, carbon, and oxygen here. If you count, there are 8 electrons for each of these atoms. And what happens is these two atoms are going to share orbitals. And what's going to happen is there's going to be some pull and push and pull from the nucleus and the electrons in the electron shell, and that creates the chemical bond there. Now, I mentioned before, you have single, double, triple bonds. Just again, remember, single bonds are between 2 electrons, double bonds are between 4 electrons, and triple bonds are between 6 electrons. There are 2 different types of covalent bonds. There are non-covalent bonds and there's polar covalent bonds. Before we move forward, though, I want to make this perfectly clear. I struggled a lot with this in college and in high school. So if you don't get this the first time you get it, you don't get this on day 2 or day 3, you're still struggling with it. It's okay. This stuff is pretty tough. I'm going to start you off with just the definitions, and I can show you some examples. We'll do a lot of work with this in class with one of the lab activities we're going to do, and it should really help you to understand the difference between polar and nonpolar. So if you don't just get it yet, just try to get a base so we can work off of that or from that later on in class. So nonpolar covalent bonds, again, covalent, we're sharing electrons, occurs when two atoms share bonds equally or share the electrons equally. These are examples of nonpolar covalent bonds. There is an equal share among these electrons between oxygen. The charges, like to describe the charges, equal out. So there's going to be a nonpolar region around this oxygen molecule. I think this is methane. Yep, methane here, CH3. This is again another non-polar covalent bond. There is equal share among the electrons between every carbon to hydrogen bond. You might not see it just from these images, but just look for I want to say conformality or basic structures like this has a line. This is 2 nice easy lines. But that will help you because again we're looking at a 2D picture here, but it's actually representing a 3D model. Just understand that there is equal sharing among the bonds or among the electrons. Non-polar covalent bonds. That's what we just talked about. Polar covalent bonds. This occurs when electrons are not being shared equally around the compound. Now you can see here, water is going to be a polar covalent bond. Or that's H2O. The electrons are going to hang around here just a little bit. I'm sorry, they're going to hang around at the bottom a little bit more. There's just a partial negative charge, and there's a partial positive charge around the hydrogen. What that means is the electrons are going to hang a little bit more around here compared to up here. And it's just due to the structure of the atom. I don't need you to know about the structure of the atom and why electrons hang around in certain places. All I need you to know is When you see these partial positive and negative charges, you're probably going to say that's a polar covalent bond. When you don't see any of those charges, or you see some easy structures like the lines here, it's probably a non-polar covalent bond. And there's one macromolecule that's really important later on, which we're going to talk about with lipids, that will really cement this in your brain. Now, what we're going to see with chemical bonding is there's two main types of chemical bonds that we're going to talk about first, which are ionic bonds and covalent bonds. Ionic bonds are the weaker of the two. So when we talk about ionic bonds, they are bonds where one atom is going to give and one atom is going to take an electron. So as an example from before, sodium chloride. You have sodium here, Na, and chlorine, which is Cl. Sodium chloride occurs when sodium gives up its one valence electron and gives the electron to chlorine. Now, when it does that, it fills that octet role for chlorine. Now, like I said before, sodium looks like it doesn't really have any, or it might just have two, because it looks like when it's bonded with chlorine, it's just sharing two. In all reality, sodium already has 8 electrons in that next electron shell down. What happens from that is sodium becomes positive. And you might be thinking, well, why does it become positive? The reason why sodium becomes positive is it's losing an electron. When an atom loses an electron, it's losing a negative charge. When atoms are by themselves, usually they're neutral. They have equal numbers of protons and protons and electrons. When it loses an electron, it's going to become positive because, again, it's losing a negative. When you lose a negative, you become more positive then. Chlorine, on the other hand, is gaining an electron. It's taking on an electron. So it's adding one electron to its atom, which means it's adding on more negativity. So it's going to it's going to become negative. Now, what happens between a positive and negative atom is they attract, and they just kind of move closer together, and there's an attraction there. Now, I describe this as like two magnets or opposite ends of magnets. They're going to pull on each other, but they're not really that strong. They can be pulled apart. These are somewhat weak bonds. You can imagine sodium chloride, when you put it in water, it breaks down pretty easily because it's not that strong of an atom. Just technical terms here, ions are atoms with a different number of electrons. So isotopes were atoms with different number of neutrons. Ions are atoms with different number of electrons. You should know the difference between the two. An anion is a negative ion, and a cation is a positive ion. And how I remember that is cat ions are positive, and then you just remember from there anions are negative. So remember cat, positive, because they have pause. Moving along with cohesion and adhesion, cohesion is when water molecules attract to each other. So when two water molecules are attracted to each other and form those hydrogen bonds, we call that cohesion. Adhesion occurs between water molecules and things that are not water molecules. So you can see in the image here, we have this polar charged object. It has an attraction force between these muscular or water guys. What happens is that attraction we label as adhesion. Cohesion is then between water molecules. Things that are not water molecules and water, that's adhesion. Now, what that also creates is something called surface tension. You might think of surface tension on the top of like a lake, and you see those skimmers that are on the lake, those skimmer bugs. The surface tension among water is also below the lake. It actually, or any body of water. It supports what's on top. So don't think surface tension is just on the top. It's everywhere in that body of water. And it really helps out with plants. Plants use the surface tension and these attractions to move water throughout a plant. That's why plants in different, like the redwood trees out in California, can grow hundreds of feet tall, is because of that surface tension and the attraction forces between the water molecules. If hydrogen bonds are weak, how is this possible? There's just so much attraction. There's so many of those water molecules that there's just so much attraction there between all those water molecules. I like to tell you or describe kids, think of the number of molecules of water in a glass cup. That number, it's a little bit large number. Think of the number of water molecules in one glass cup. That equals the number of cups of water in all of the oceans. So I'm going to say it again. The number of molecules of water in one glass cup is equal or equivalent to the number of cups in all of the oceans. That's a lot of molecules. You can imagine there's a lot of molecules there. There's going to be a lot of attraction forces there. Our last characteristic that we're going to talk about today of water is density. And it might, appear to you to be common sense, but it's actually really crucial for life and really important in biology. That is, solid water, ice, is less dense than liquid water. And that's like, oh, okay, yeah, like ice floats, it's less dense. Not many molecules or compounds react that way in life. Think about it. The solid form of things, they usually sink, right? You put most anything that's solid in a batch of water, it's going to sink. But in this case, solid water floats, and it does this no matter where you're at in the world or in the universe. It floats. That's really interesting. The reason why is when ice freezes or when water freezes to ice, it forms these hydrogen bonds in such a pattern that it's actually more spaced out than when it was a liquid. Okay. So when it's more spaced out, it's less dense. So that's why ice floats when it's a solid, and that's why when the ice becomes a water, it sinks. That's backwards thinking. Again, think about solid things. They usually sink in water. If we did not have this, if ice would have sunk, it would kill everything in our lakes and everything in our oceans. Think about if ice at the top, if it would sink, then it would start freezing from the bottom up. What actually ice does at the top, it actually insulates a lot of lakes during the winter. So that's why whenever in the winter you walk past the lake and it's frozen on top, and then the next, summer you can still have fish in there, it's because that ice actually insulates the fish. It actually keeps that lake a little bit warmer than typical. If ice would go from the bottom up and freeze from the bottom up all the way up to the top, all the fish would die. Evolutionarily, if that happened, life couldn't have arisen on Earth. The first life was in the oceans, and without that, if the ice would have sank, all of the fish and all of our ancestors from millions and billions of years ago would have died off really quickly. So we needed ice to float in order for life to evolve on Earth. Now, acids and bases are one of our last concepts that we're going to go over. Acids they have an excess amount of hydrogen ions. Bases have an excess amount of hydroxyl ions. So remember that water molecule that we talked about before. Remember that when you break that up, you're going to get a hydrogen ion on one side and a hydroxyl ion on the other side. Now, this hydrogen ion, here's a big tip. Hydrogen ions are only protons. Hydrogen ions are only protons. The hydroxyl ion, the OH here, is negative because the hydrogen ion gave up its electron to hydroxyl. So that's why it says H plus here. It's just literally a proton. The hydroxyl ion is an oxygen with another electron onto it. Now, and another proton, but that's besides the case. Acids are liquids with a lot of hydrogen ions. Bases are liquids with a lot of hydroxyl ions. In the middle, we have pure water. We have equal amounts of hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions. Now, again, we have this pH scale. We go from 0 to 14, and this is a logarithmic scale. It's not like 6 is 1 times amount or the acidic as 7, and 5 is 2 times. It's a logarithmic scale of 10. So 6 is 10 times more acidic than 7. 5 is 10 times more acidic than 6, and 100 times more acidic than 7. 4 is 10 times acidic as 5, 100 times more acidic than 6, and 1,000 times more acidic than 7. So every time you multiply it by 10. So something that has an acidity of 0 is very acidic compared to something that's 7. Something that has an acidity or a pH of 6 is only mildly more acidic than 7 if you compare them that way. Is there anything else you have to know? No, just know that 0 to 7 is acidic, 7 to 14 is more basic, 7 here in the middle is neutral. The closer to 14 you get, it's more basic. The more closer to 0, the more acidic it is.